Let's start. We're on, great. So today, we need to cover an extraordinary amount of ground. Basically, we need to cover 20th century history, 20th century literary movements, 20th century visual art movements, and we need to talk about some kind of turn of the century, late 1800s stuff about why the 20th century turned out like it did. Now, a lot of this stuff is going to cross over into what you've already studied in your history classes. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. I want you to have background on all this stuff, so it'll be as easy for you as possible. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. If you need me to stop so you can write down a slide, I'm not that interested in stopping. If you need to stop me because you have a question or something doesn't make sense, by all means stop me then. Does that make sense? I feel like there's a distinction there that's important. So we're calling this modernism, postmodernism, how being happy is nearly impossible, but we suggest it anyway, which is an incredibly postmodern kind of sentiment. But if we're going to talk about postmodernism, we have to talk about modernism. There's just no way around it. All movements, whether it's a literary movement, political movement, an art movement, whatever you can think of, starts with something else. It's always a reaction to something. It's never an isolated incident. They are not spontaneous, no matter how much they may seem to be so. They're always the culmination of different factors coming together at a crucial point, and then something setting them off. We're going to see with the modernist and postmodernist movement, there are very specific historical things that set these off. But even so, they linger in time. Setting hard and fast begin and end dates for these things is rather difficult. For our purposes, we're discussing the literary movements which are labeled as modernist and postmodernist movements. We will also find ourselves talking about visual art movements that correspond to the ideas in these literary movements, but we'll see they have a malleable relationship. Visual art tends to move faster than written art because it takes less time to produce and less time to spread. So it moves at a little bit quicker pace. So modernism, if we're going to have dates, is said to begin just after World War I and last until just the very end of World War II. Again, these are incredibly approximate dates. You could easily make an argument that the modernist movement really started around like 1904, but as a widespread notion, everyone has more or less agreed to say the end of World War I in 1918. For similar reasons, we say that the postmodern movement began at the end of World War II, which would be 1945. Again, these are approximates. One could certainly make the argument we never left the modernist movement, that we're still in it ultimately, and that postmodernism is just an extension of that movement. But we'll get to those ideas in a moment. Again, these are incredibly loose periods of time. That's pretty much what I just said. In fact, that's exactly what I just said. But this part's an interesting addition to it. The ideas of the modernists are so revolutionary, are so groundbreaking, that there's kind of nowhere to go. We can try to be cool and we can try to say awesome, interesting things, but it is impossible for us to be more rebellious or more punk rock than the modernists. Whenever someone rebels and thinks, oh, I'm really shocking, I can't help but think, you're really not. Everyone already pushed it further than anyone else can in contrast to what came before. So as a result, because we cannot step out of the shadow of the modernists, we have to get in step with what they're doing. Now let's talk about the root causes, the things that came together, those factors that created the modernist movement. Again, a lot of these are going to be review for you. These are all going to be gone over individually, so don't worry about writing them all down right now if you miss something. So there's a few things. One, the invention or discovery, depending on how you want to define these things, of psychoanalysis and psychology, particularly the theories of Freud and Jung, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. We'll get to both of them in a minute. Has anyone taken psychology yet? So you're talking about like history of psychology, you're familiar with Freudian theory, you're familiar with Jungian theory, archetypes, all that stuff? Okay, we'll visit them incredibly briefly, but it'd be good to draw upon your prior knowledge with that stuff. Mechanization and the Industrial Revolution. You've all studied the Industrial Revolution, right? Yeah. So we'll talk about it with extreme brevity. We'll be very briefly touching on it, but again, you want to use your prior knowledge of that. The age of reproducibility. We're actually not going to get to talk about that very much today, as much as I would like to. There's a lot of cool writings about it, but we're not going to have time for it today. Particularly, you got it, like Walter Benjamin writes a lot about it. Baudrillard writes about it. Roland Barthes. There's all kinds of cool stuff about it, but we're not really going to get to talk about it today. Photography, I somehow don't have a slide talking about this. I need to remember to talk about it. Evolutionary theory and Darwin. While that comes a little bit earlier in all this, I mean more than a little bit, like 50 years earlier, those ideas kind of hit the mainstream at this time. The rise of nationalism and the decline of the aristocracy. The rise of the middle class becoming an economic force, and the rise of the titans of industry. Extreme wealth being pocketed away with just a few people. The invention of nearly instant communication and the spread of media. All of this stuff combines, along with some really ghastly world events, to greatly change and completely reinvent what we think of as art and literature in the 20th century. Oh, Ron Burgundy, it will make sense. Oh God, do you guys like Anchorman? Yeah. That's not a strong reaction. All right, go. I can't really make a homework, but you should all see Anchorman if you're going to be cool. All right, try to picture what life was like before all the stuff we just listed. You live in a home that looks more or less like the one you live in now, actually. Architecture didn't change that much. But electricity wasn't around. As such, at night your home is lit by lamps that burn oil. It produces a ton of smoke. Everyone's house smells really bad. One of your chores when you have to clean up around the house is you have to scrub the soot off the walls. It's a very different life. Women are in the home. If they're not in the home, they're either teachers or they have a really, really terrible job. They are not allowed any kind of upward mobility. Girls usually left school by about 6th grade or so because you didn't want a woman knowing too much more than that. That was a dangerous thing. None of the young ladies in this room would be in here right now. Children are not much regarded. That's kind of true. People loved their own children very much, but they didn't care about children in general. This is why we had things like child labor, which we'll get to in a bit. There's no cars. Horses pull carts. This is not that long ago. People die young from really stupid stuff. There's no vaccinations. There's no antibiotics. You get an infection in your arm because you, cut yourself while trying to climb a fence. You're going to lose the arm. That's it. The infection might not come out, and it might ultimately kill you. Now, you might maybe save up to have a portrait painted of your miserable family. You don't have photos of each other. There's no Instagram. There's not even film. You don't have pictures of your family. If you really save up, you might get a painting of them. You're born into a life that you didn't choose and you are stuck there. If you're born into a family of coopers, right? People who make barrels, you're a barrel maker. That's what you're going to be. Your dad's a barrel maker. Your grandfather was a barrel maker. That's it. You come from a family of, cobblers making shoes. That's it. Farmers. You're going to farm. You have no choice in life. Whatever life you're born into, that's the one you're going to have. Now, there's no point in even questioning. This is really the big change. Right now, there's this ethos that we've pushed onto students, which is good, of what do you want to do? You can do it, right? Set yourself to it and that can happen. That's not a notion that existed. People just accept their little crappy lives because that's all that there is. What's more, there's a plan in the heavens. And this is part of the plan. How dare you question your station in life? The poor are poor because they're meant to be poor. The rich are rich because they're meant to be rich. They're allowed to exploit them because that's the purpose of having poor people. And poor people are going to go, it sucks, but what are you going to do, right? They're a king. What am I? That's about it. All right. But then everything changes. It feels like overnight. We're talking within about 10 years. From when you were in kindergarten to now, everything changes. Electricity in homes. Instant communication. People leave their farms. We go from being an agrarian society to an industrial society. So they leave the farms because there's now mechanized farming. They don't need all these workers on the land, so they get fired. And they move to the cities to work in factories. Photography and movies absolutely destroy the central conceits of what we understood art to be. A good artist for thousands of years was someone who was technically skillful and could make something look like it did in real life. With photography, what's the point? If I can go and get a portrait of my family painted, it will take weeks for it to happen. We all got to stand there and pretend we're happy, right, with our kind of neutral faces because it's hard to smile that long. I'm going to have to pay them this exorbitant fund. I have to train for years and years if I'm going to be a painter. Or you can take a one-day class, get a camera, and start producing perfect reproductions of people. And cheap. What's the point in being a visual artist then? Why bother? Why bother with sculpture when you can mold something with a machine? So So artists have this crisis where they have to figure out, what does it mean to be an artist? What am I trying to do? And they realize they have to start portraying things that cannot be painted. That cannot be photographed, rather. They have to do things that are visually different somehow, and we'll come back to that in a bit. We start to understand that our minds are complex and made of systems. That's the advent of psychoanalysis. Science becomes unstoppable. We keep destroying things that we guaranteed, that we assumed, that we were certain were true and would always stay true. Now they start falling away. And as a result, people begin to question their faith. What's the placement of faith in my life? What's the origin of mankind? Darwin has called all of this into question, things that we assume to be true always. The earth keeps getting older. At the time, Bible interpretation was almost entirely literal. Now suddenly, at the same time, dinosaur bones are being discovered. It's impossible to fathom. These aren't mentioned in anything I've ever heard about in my life. How can they exist? The spread of illiteracy builds ideas of inherent self-worth among the lower and middle classes. Books are cheaper and cheaper to produce. People are doing more schooling because of the rise of the middle class. And because they have more access to education, because they have more access to literacy and books, they're having bigger ideas. And they're wondering this question. Then what's it all mean? Why do I suffer? In purpose of what? Doesn't my suffering matter? Don't I matter? Now this gets exacerbated because of other things we'll get to in a second. And maybe the scariest part is no one has an answer. You ask around for wisdom and no one has any to give. They just have more and more questions. There's all this technology making all this new stuff. Electricity, appliances, motorized vehicles, everything's going faster than it used to. Not a little faster, much faster. Including communication. Newspapers are being printed with news that happened the day before. It used to take weeks. There's telephones. I realize now no one uses their phones to call anybody. We just use them to put pictures of ourselves up. But people used to use them to call people. Wow. I know.
All you youngsters out there.
But think about it like this. If your grandmother passed, you wouldn't find out for a couple months. There's a letter in the mail. Great. Oh, grandma died. She was buried 6 weeks ago.
Now we just get texts.
Now you find out instantly. You want to wish someone happy birthday? You can call them up, wish them happy birthday. You didn't talk to family. You didn't talk to friends. There was no way to talk to anyone. But now, instant communication all the way around the world. With the transatlantic cable, we're getting news from Europe the day it happens. You used to have to travel by boat. This is extraordinary stuff. Now, all that new stuff and all that growth come at the expense of horrific labor practices. Someone has to make all the stuff. And there's no labor laws in existence at this time. They're not a thing. So, child labor, totally fine. Minimum wage doesn't exist. 8-hour workday doesn't exist. Weekends, that's a joke, right? You'll be here whenever I want you to be here. Those machines need to be built and operated by the owners of the machine, and the owners of the machines aren't the ones doing that. The poor do it, but they have no choice because it's that or starve. You don't want to take the crappy job, someone else will. Mechanized farming, again, has made food cheaper to produce with less labor, so the labor force has to go somewhere, and they go to the cities. Now, we should talk about this a little bit. We'll come back to it when we talk about Marx and the idea of the means of production and ownership. This produces an extraordinary amount of money. There's a lot of money now in the world, and there's a lot of disparity between the rich and the poor. Nothing like there was then. I'm not defending what it is now. I think CEO pay is gross and all the rest. But this is bonkers stuff. So, now, if we calculate wealth, if we use land and gold, like Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great, they're the wealthiest people to ever live. But if you look at money, at liquid cash, things change around a bit. Now, that's Bill Gates, right? That's Jeff Bezos. They've been going back and forth for the last 5 years of who's the wealthiest person in the world between the two of them. They keep alternating back and forth. Bezos had pulled ahead. I don't mean this distastefully, just as a fact. His recent divorce has put him more firmly in second place. He lost a lot of money in the deal. As Amazon stock goes up and down, his worth goes up and down. Same with Gates. Their wealth is not entirely liquid. I mean, they have more money in their wallet than we do, certainly. But he doesn't have billions of dollars in his bank account. He's got Amazon stock that's worth a bunch of money. Does that make sense? That's how wealth is calculated for them. Now, they're each worth in the neighborhood of $90 billion. It's a lot of money. Each worth around 90 billion, give or take. Bezos now is probably closer to maybe 80 or so, but he's doing fine, right? Yeah. But these dudes had real money. When you adjust for inflation, the amount of money they have blows Bezos and Gates out of the water. So we said they had around 90 billion, is that right? Yeah. All right. Carnegie is around 372 billion.
Wait, what?
Rockefeller's around 341, adjusted for inflation. Oil, steel, and railroads were the main sources of wealth at the time. Again, owning the means of production. Okay? How they make and move the stuff. So this is an extraordinary sum of money. Here's the craziest part. Income taxes didn't exist yet. So not only do they have all this money, they don't pay taxes on any of it. Now, granted, the rich don't pay a lot of taxes these days, but they're at least supposed to. The laws don't even exist yet. So their wealth grows and grows and grows. If you get a chance someday in life, go to one of their estates, the homes they built for themselves, they're cities. They built themselves towns of their own to live in. Crazy stuff, crazy stuff. So there's all this money, and then human beings invent flight. The thing that seems most impossible in the world, and we're suddenly doing it. People are in the air, which is just mind-boggling. Seems like there's nothing that human beings cannot do. Here's a crazy thing. There are people who lived in a span of time where they read the newspaper about the first flight and they read the newspaper about landing on the moon. This is not that long ago. This is pretty recent stuff when you really think about it. I mean, a couple generations, it's not much. Movies and recorded music. Entertainment becomes pop culture, where everyone can like the same thing at the same time. That was never the case before. When there was a singer you liked, you saw them whenever they came through town. You didn't have recordings of them. You didn't have the same musician you liked as someone else, because you wouldn't see the same people. They would just travel around town to town. Same thing for actors. They'd be on the stage, so you wouldn't see an actor. You wouldn't be excited about the actor. You'd be excited just to see any actor on stage. With movies and recorded music, suddenly celebrities exist when they never have before. The idea of being famous for what you do hadn't existed. This is Maurice Chevalier. He was a singer and actor. We can't fathom what fame was like for these people. Unbelievable. I'll tell you a story in just a second. That's Louise Brooks, the actress. I think is still one of the coolest actresses to ever exist. This is Charlie Chaplin. They're actually both Charlie Chaplin. That's Chaplin in makeup as a little tramp. That's Chaplin as he looked in his everyday life. Chaplin was so famous that when he would take a train to go somewhere, at the train station would be a crowd literally a mile deep of people who had no hope of seeing him. They just wanted to be kind of near him.
Me?
Now, I mean, you see a famous person, you get a selfie with them, you keep going, they finish grocery shopping. Chaplin couldn't leave his house, ever, for like 40 years. Chaplin's fame is hard to fathom. And it got to the point where they would be forgiven for anything. The wealth and the fame they had was so much they could do anything they wanted, including in the case of Chaplin, marrying a couple 14-year-olds in a row. And no one cared. They're like, Charlie. Oh yeah, Charlie liked very young women. So, I'm not defending his choices, I'm just saying that's how famous he was. Although not everyone could get away with it. Fatty Arbuckle had his career ruined, but that's a whole other story. So, now somehow us human beings, we're so wealthy, we're so smart, we're so powerful, we're also so beat down, we're so poor, and we're so taken advantage of, that we're left wondering more questions once again. What are we supposed to do? Science keeps breaking down walls to new frontiers of understanding. Things keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, which they're still getting smaller now, which is crazy that we can't find a base unit of matter, right? Vaccines, medicines, antibiotics come around a little bit later, but they're worth kind of taking into this conversation. You guys are aware of Einstein?
No.
Beyond as a pop figure, you're aware of the things he did?
Yeah.
Okay, theory of relativity, declaring that matter is not indestructible, that time and space are relative to an observer's position, the universe is infinite in, size and yet somehow expanding. Lots of changes in modern thought. Freud, we should talk about Freud a little bit. Freud's the father of psychoanalysis, right? He's the one who comes up with the big ideas that become the foundation of what we now call psychology, and to a lesser degree psychiatry. Although his ideas are largely debunked, we don't really use those anymore. They're a little bit out of fashion, but they're still the basis that everything was developed around. Now, Freud's ideas are all about, there's three main parts of your mind: the id, the ego, and the superego. These three kind of compartments of your being are in constant battle with one another. Your id is your most base level of thought. All right? I want to eat, I want to fight, and I want to have sex. That's about it. Real animalistic caveman stuff. Your superego is the exact opposite. Your superego is all about that which is most pure and most lovely and most decent. Think of it as like your conscience telling you the right thing to do all the time. Your ego is stuck in the middle, trying to watch these two battle it out to decide what you actually do in your everyday life. There's some people, Freud would say, who their id is too strong. They're too liable to do violent, selfish things. There's people who their superego is a little bit too strong, and as a result, they don't do anything, and they're just consumed with worry all the time. Your ego is trying to sort it all out. He would also say there are stages of development, that everyone goes through these stages, but then we get stuck in some of them. Like the Oedipal complex is a Freudian notion. You remember the Oedipal complex? Oedipal complex is a thing that happens to young men where they find themselves romantically in love with their moms and wishing the murder of their fathers. The idea is that as babies, they bond to mom because mom's the most important person in their life, and as a result, they fall in love with her, but eventually you grow out of this stage. Freud would say not everyone does grow out of this stage, and it causes you all kinds of problems in your mind. There's a version for women called the Electra Complex, which is basically the same thing. You love dad and you want mom dead. All right? This is all Freudian stuff. I'm not saying anyone in this room has these things. I can see some people are alarmed. I'm not accusing anyone. To be very clear. I'm not out loud. There's a couple of people I'm suspicious of, but I don't want to say it. I like that some people became paranoid, like, ooh, wait a second. I didn't say any names. Calm down. All right. Very briefly, let's return to this. Freud had a student named Carl Jung. It was his protege, right? Jung and Freud had a split. They had a schism in their relationship. And Jung's theories took on another direction where he was dealing with something called archetypes. He was of this idea that all of humanity has these images and these symbols that we process collectively all the time, that our dreams are the key to accessing these things, that our stories have them. So the hero's journey is an archetype. It's why we respond to those stories. Good guys and bad guys and mother figures and the seductress and on and on. Those are all archetypes according to Jung, but that's really a conversation for another day. All right, Marx. Now, Marx was around quite a bit before what we're talking about. I mean, he died in 1883. His main theory came out in 1860s, right around there. Marxism is a theory of economics and social class, social organization, the structure of it, which says that all societies are run by what he would call the bourgeoisie. Now, the bourgeoisie, or you guys know about the bourgeoisie? The bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are the people who own the means of production. They own the factories, they own the land. They are the upper classes. They're the wealthy. Marx would say their power depends entirely on the exploitation of what he called the proletariat. The proletariat being the labor, the people who till the fields of the farms, the people who work the machines in the factory. What Marxism declared was that the poor, the proletariat, need to rise up and take ownership of the means of production away from the bourgeoisie. Having done so, they need to spread ownership around to everyone. And everyone will share everything. Everyone will work together toward a common goal, and everyone will prosper as a result. There will no longer be rich and poor. Everyone will be on an even playing field. This is the founding philosophy of socialism and communism. Now, I don't want to get too much into nationalism, fascism, and things of that nature. Suffice to say, communism, as we have seen it in the world, is more... The major flaws with it are in human nature and in dictatorships and fascist behaviors. We have to be careful not to confuse socialism with communism, they're not quite the same thing. There's some major differences in what underpins them. But the idea of this, the very notion that people would rise up and take back control, is completely revolutionary. Indeed. I mean, it's what creates much of the politics of the 20th century. And today, we're still dealing with a lot of this stuff. All right. So influences of Freud and Marx together. These emerging modernist thinkers concern themselves with the inner being as well as the outer being, more than the social being. They look for ways to incorporate all these new ideas into their writing and into their art. Modernist writers look inside themselves for answers instead of seeking truth through traditional authority and sources. You don't look to science, you don't look to religion, you don't look to any of that stuff. Where is it in you? We need to look inward for our truths. We need to look to the structures of the mind. Freud is a huge influence on the modernists. Now, whether you're a Marxist or not, Marxism demonstrated that the individual is lost as a cog in the machine of the economic system. That the idea of the individual is being pushed down and needs to be lifted back up. I'm flying through this stuff, and some of it sounds a little bit self-contradictory, but all will come together in the end. Because we're not even talking about realism and naturalism, and a lot of the stuff's rebellion against previous movements, but that's all right. So a question emerges for what will soon be the modernists. So much has changed. Technology, social structures, what we believe to be true. And there's a haunting and terrifying question at the center of this. Is God dead? Not, is there a God? Have we killed God with our progress? Have we exterminated religion? That is an incredibly frightening thought for people. It's the underpinning of their daily life. And they're worried that maybe there is no longer meaning. Everything has been crushed. Philosophers worry about the very purpose of religion now. If human beings are solving all this stuff, where does prayer fit into this? Where does the divine fit in? And if we don't have our faith, where are we to find meaning? Despair sets in. What's the point? Our greatness is so enormous. We're doing so much, but maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's all for naught. And then, at the nadir, at the very bottom, the sink of our depression, combined with all our triumphs, but it's kind of a hollowness there, the Great War happens, World War I. After all that progress, after all those insights, all these advantages and advances, we don't seem to have learned any great lessons out of it. There was so much there, and we didn't absorb it. We didn't do the right thing. We thought we were going to create utopias, and instead we blow each other up. It's a war that has so much going on. So much of the world is wrapped up in it. Oh, this is very exciting. Let's see. Okay, thanks. Valerie, it's for you. So, World War I is an absurd war. It's comforting to think when we make war movies, we make them about World War II. Why?
Because it's the most recent.
It's not the most recent. I mean, hell, we're in a war right now. So not the most recent. And even if it was like a matter of finished wars, I mean, Vietnam's far more recent. The Desert Storm's a lot more recent. It was big.
Significant.
Johnny?
We have more people that remember about it versus World War I.
We're pretty much out of World War II vets. It's because it's easy to see who the good guys and bad guys are. Nazis are bad. We're good. It's very easy. You make a video game of World War II because very few people will be sad when the Nazi gets shot. You can't do that with World War I. There aren't bad guys in World War I. It's a bunch of people who are weirdly contractually obligated to be there. Bismarckian policies in foreign relations. You guys did World War I, right? So Otto von Bismarck. It's kind of a huge web of treaties everyone gets wrapped up in, right? One domino falls with the assassination. Suddenly everyone's in this thing that no one wants to be in. And all the new technology produces means of killing each other that are unfathomable. It's totally absurd. When I was reading World War I stuff, the images that stick out to me are always how absurd it was. Tanks had just been invented. The first tanks emerged, right? So there are moments where tanks are rolling along the Ardennes next to men on horses. Literally, tanks and horses are next to each other in this war. It's bonkers to think about. There's Zouaves. Zouaves were a kind of like fancy division of soldiers. They're originally French, although there are versions in the United States as well. And they had this very ornate costume with billowy pants, kind of like MC Hammer pants. And they wore a snappy red fez because they're from a time when soldiers would just march in lines and fire guns that weren't very accurate, go, bah, and they'd reload and whatever. Those were the Zouaves. Does that seem like a problem in World War I? There's suddenly sniper rifles and machine guns, and it's dudes with red hats running around. They didn't do well in the war, as you can probably imagine. And the horrors of it are so extreme. The stuff that always haunted me most in reading it comes actually from the same horse thing. Of soldiers would talk about the horses would be running along the fields and, cannon fire and shrapnel and all the rest would eviscerate, would gut a horse, and it'd be running in its own guts and screaming. And men would lay in the trenches listening to the horses scream all night because you didn't want to waste ammunition on putting them out of their misery. This is terrible stuff. Poison gas is invented and being lobbed over into the trenches, and the men, their faces are literally melting off their skulls. There were veterans after the war who wore porcelain masks the rest of their lives to hide that they didn't have a face anymore. Terrible, terrible stuff. Europe's population is decimated. They are economically and spiritually destroyed at the end of the war. And all these veterans come back from the war with a question of, what the hell is that for? What did we achieve? You guys heard about the first Christmas during World War I? That story's the craziest. First Christmas, they call a truce, just for Christmas Day, right? The men get up out of the trenches and they have dinner together, on both sides. Get up, Germans, Austrians, French, British, they get out, they play some soccer. This is totally true. They hang out and they pal around. The next day, they go back to shooting each other. It was hard to get them to shoot each other though, because they're like, I just had dinner with that guy, he seemed all right. So instead of saying, maybe we shouldn't have war anymore, maybe we should stop this whole thing, the general said, no more timeouts. Christmas Day, keep shooting them. Terrible, terrible stuff. Anyway, so, yeah, it's bad. Here's how crazy it was. So the war ended November 11th, so 11/11 at 11/11, right? So they knew to the minute when the war was going to stop. Up till the last second, they were still shooting each other. They knew the war was coming. They knew the ceasefire was going to happen. And like, oh, we got 10 more minutes to shoot each other. Let's keep going. Terrible stuff. Terrible. So you can imagine coming home from this, you'd be a different person. The world seemed full of promise, and now it seems full of garbage. So they come back and they decide to write and paint. World War I is ghastly stuff. It's kind of amazing to me that we don't talk about it more. I think it is because the moral questions, the ethical questions of it are so troubling. We really, makes for uncomfortable conversations. World War II conversations tend to be very, we're good, yay, it's very self-congratulatory, whether it should be or not for any war. All right, so you already have all this stuff. World War I, urbanization, people moving into cities, industrialization, technological evolution, photography in the movies, growth of modern science, Freud and Marx. So we're in pretty good shape. Urbanization, it's around 1900. Look at that. It's horse-drawn carts through cities. Wild, so cool. Oh man, less cool, little kids working on machines. You know why you really want little kids on those machines? Yeah, little hands. And you know what happens if they lose an arm?
Keep going.
Yeah, you get a new one. Toss them out. Get a new kid. They're very cheap. Seriously, that's the thought. That's why Rockefeller lives in his own little city. He's good with little kids getting their arms ripped off. Shifts in the modern nation. We go from country to city, from farm to factory, from native born to new citizen. We didn't even talk about that, but that's a whole other day. The rise of immigration and how those different cultures mixing together influenced art. The introduction of mass and pop culture. Everything's speeding up. Split between science and literary tradition, and a lost purpose for art and artists. You guys watch Arrested Development?
Yes.
You taste these tears. Taste my sad Michael. It's my Job impression. All right, so you guys need to get into Arrested Development. Well, first 3 seasons. After that, you don't have to watch it. After World War I, we get the lost generation, a term I'm sure you heard in your history classes. Many young Americans feel like outsiders within their own culture. They come home and they have no place to be. It's hard to come to terms with what they have seen in the war. They're also finding themselves confronted and realizing that there's terrible racism and sexism in their home countries. And they're not comfortable with that either. A big progressive movement grows out of this. Modernists begin to experiment with their own styles. Rather than tap into the literary forms of this culture they don't feel safe in, they decide to make their own. They reject everything. Traditional marriage? Nope, not for me. Traditional fashion? Nope. Traditional writing, traditional painting, they don't want anything to do with any of it. Now, this pervasive sense of alienation, this feeling like they don't belong, drives many young people to move to Europe. They become the expats, the expatriates. Most notable among these are people like Gertrude Stein and Hemingway, Eliot, Pound, Frost. Eliot, it's funny, he ended up living in England for the rest of his life, and people can't decide whether he was an American poet or an English poet. Both countries kind of claim him because he's so good. He's from St. Louis. Anyway. They go and live abroad, largely in Paris, because it's so cheap. Paris, the French economy, is destroyed after the war. Meanwhile, America's economy is booming. We're making tons of money, hand over fist. And the dollar is super strong relative to the franc. So American families, middle-class families, they have this kid who's kind of a mess suddenly, and they're like, you need to get away and kind of figure all your stuff out. So you send them to Europe, where it's cheaper to send your kid to Europe and have them live in Paris than have them live with you at home. As a result, the cafes and the restaurants and the galleries are full of brilliant young people who just want to figure out the world. So in the coffee shop, very literally, you have the greatest literary and artistic minds in history sitting a couple tables away from each other. It's crazy. Nothing else has ever happened like it. It's not to say that they all know each other, but they all had like run-ins with each other. It's not exactly a club, but kind of is. So again, this idea that we have to reject everything that came before us, social structures, political structures, religious, artistic. I know a lot of this is repetitive. It gives you a chance to catch up on your notes. Art must be renovated. As a result, modernist writing is marked by a break from all prior tradition. It rejects all prior assumptions and values. So why do they call it modern? The idea of modern implies a nowness and a separation from what came before. It rejects history and the society who that history is a record of. The literature that they produce tends to be extremely pessimistic. They tend to be a little apprehensive toward pop culture. They don't like it. Modernist writing is incredibly snooty and stuck up and arrogant stuff. I like it a lot, but I'm kind of snooty and stuck up and arrogant, so I guess that works. They start to reject the idea of the Roaring Twenties. Bless you. Goodness. Goodness. Oh, that was amazing. All right, so you can look at this to a degree as a rejection of the whole Roaring Twenties mindset of let's party and drink. That's not entirely true. I mean, Fitzgerald definitely embraced the partying part of this, but he's kind of an outlier. Literature becomes the place where you can find the one meaningful activity, the search for meaning. Therefore, their belief is literature shouldn't be fun. Literature is important suddenly. It demands your full attention and study. Visual art does similar things, but in different ways that we'll get to in a second. A lot of the things that visual art does at that time is really closer to postmodernist in its ideas, but again, these timelines get a little funky. All right, characteristics of modernist writing, pardon me. They move away from realism and into abstraction. There's no need to tell stories like, Charles Dickens. If it's something you can just observe, then you can put it in a movie, and movies exist, so why bother? They gotta do something movies can't do. Don't bother with the exterior, go to the interior, things that cannot be photographed. They are deliberately complex. Modernist writings are hard to read, and they mean for it to be hard to read. They want it to be tough. As a result, it's pretty snooty, and it's pretty elitist. The readers and fans of modernist writing tend to be extremely well read and well educated, because you need to do a lot of work and practice to be ready to read it, which is kind of crappy in its way. I agree, but it's what it is. There's a high degree of aesthetic self-consciousness. Style matters suddenly. All the stuff I love in writing, when we talk about syntax and diction and all these different literary and rhetorical devices, the modernists embrace that more than anyone else ever had before. They bring up questions of what it means to be, what it is to exist. They break with tradition, we've talked about this. They break with the modes of form. They reinvent what the novel can be. This results in extreme fragmentation. We'll talk about some of these in a moment. Incredibly innovative experimental work. They end up with a large variety in content because of this idea we'll get to again in a moment that everyone is worth a story. The lower classes, the middle classes, the upper classes, everyone is worth writing about. Everyone has complexity and worth. There's also a lot of protest work, a lot of political work that comes out of this time. All right, techniques. We're going to go through all these individually. Collapsed plots, fragmentary techniques, shifts in perspective, voice, and tone, stream of consciousness. We'll come to that, it's super important. Allusion and hidden meanings. We've talked about allusions in class already. There's also talk about mechanization and the age of reproducibility, but we're not going to get into that today. We're not going to have enough time. But we did talk about this a bit. Artists and writers need to do things that photos and movies cannot do. If you can make a movie of your book, you have failed as a writer. Your job is to go beyond what movies are capable of. Now, okay, collapsed plots. When we think of a plot, we think of like Freytag's pyramid, right? Inciting incident, rising action, complications, conflict, climax, falling action, denouement, all that stuff. They throw all that stuff away. They don't want to have anything like a traditional plot. They'll just start in the middle of the story with no background. They'll stop the book before the story has properly ended to leave you unsatisfied deliberately, to show you there is no satisfaction. You will not be happy at the end of this book. They sometimes just have moments that don't seem to be connected to one another and are just set up next to one another. William Faulkner being kind of the master of this. The Sound of Fury is arguably one of his masterpieces. It's in his top 3 books, which is number 1, people kind of fight about. Sound of Fury is a book divided into 4 sections about a woman named Caddy. Caddy is this rebellious, vibrant, energetic woman who leaves everyone around her, I don't know, changed in some way. And she's barely in the book. Instead, the book has 4 different narrators. The first 3 are her brothers. The last it's kind of a third-person narrator, but it's from the perspective of their housekeeper. It's about her, but we never get to understand her or really know what she thinks. We just get impressions of her from others. Even more troublingly, each of her brothers is in their way ill-equipped to tell her story. One of them is so greedy and cruel, all he does is hurt people around him. One of them is romantically in love with his sister and is so torn apart by it, he decides to end his own life. And one of them is severely mentally impaired and does not understand the concept of time. So mid-sentence, he'll jump 15 years and not tell you that he has done so. It is an incredibly difficult book to read, but goes into this idea of a collapsed plot. They tend to suggest rather than assert. They hint at things, they don't tell you things. Let's see. As a result, the reader must participate in the meaning creation. They don't give you answers, you have to figure them out. Now this kind of mirrors the struggle people go through in their daily lives of, I need to create meaning in my life, how do I do that? The process by which we search for meaning in art mirrors and almost shows us a model for how to find meaning in our own lives. Enjoyment becomes a process. You don't sit back and relax while reading anymore, you're working during it. That's the aspect of it I really like. Now this is for me. Lots of people, they want to just sit back and relax with an easy book. I get it. Nothing wrong with relaxing with a book. I like it when it's challenging me and is really remarkably difficult. That's me. All right. Fragmentary techniques, we've talked about some of this stuff already. Modernist literature is in a way notable for what it omits. Clear connections, clear explanations, all that stuff is gone. Continuity, perspective, sequence, unity, all that stuff's abandoned. Long works tend to be an assemblage of fragments. Short stories are little tiny bits. Instead of having, here's this whole adventure, it's, here's me making tea. That's it. And you have to look for the symbols in it to get some kind of meaning out of it. Fragmentation in literature is meant to reflect the reality and the flux of our everyday lives. The constant variations and change in our kind of normalcy. All right, we talked about this a little bit as well. Everyone's worth a novel and everything is worth writing about. Do you want to know the scary part? We've done all these notes. We haven't even gotten to postmodernism yet. Oh no, don't worry, it'll be fine. So, we get shifts in perspective and voice and tone. This is very important. There's been an idea in literature that there's things you write about and things you don't write about. There's certain kinds of stories you tell and certain kinds of stories you don't. The modernists throw all that away. Nothing is off limits. And as a result, censorship comes down hard on a lot of them. Many people say the greatest novel ever written is Ulysses by James Joyce. I'd have to disagree, to be clear. I've never managed to finish it. I find it impossible.
Why?
Ulysses is, give or take, 500 pages long. It takes place in one day. It's every thought in a man's head as he walks around Dublin. Every thought in his head. All of them. He isn't entirely in his right mind because he's paranoid and he's jealous of a relationship his wife had with someone else. He will start making up words at different points. He'll just launch into other languages. There's an extraordinary number of characters you have to keep track of. It's nearly impossible. The book is like a big middle finger to readers. Like, go ahead, finish this, I dare you.
Do you plan to finish it before you die?
I have other things I want to do before I die.
Okay.
Like almost anything else. His follow-up book is called Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake is even harder. When he wrote Ulysses, someone asked him why the book was so hard, right? And he said to them something along the lines of, this is not verbatim, but he said, it took me 7 years to write, it should take you 7 years to read it. He wasn't kidding. Finnegan's Wake took him 17.
What?
It has multiple languages, huge, it's bonkers. Finnegan's Wake, here's how crazy Finnegan's Wake is. The first sentence in the book is the last half of a sentence. It just starts in the middle of a sentence, right? The last sentence of the book is the first half of that sentence. The whole thing's an endless circle.
I don't like this.
I love it in theory, but I don't want to read it. That one's too hard for me. I like challenges, but that one's a little much. Let's see. So again, this stuff clearly can get pretty snooty. Modernist fiction is often written in the first person. Literature before that tend to be in the third person. The omniscient narrator talking about everything that's going on. Because modernist writing is more about subjectivity, we see a lot more of the first person. And it limits us to their perspective of what's going on. This aligns with the modernist idea that there's no such thing as a singular truth. There's your truth and there's my truth. They don't align and yet they're both true. It's a very modernist mode of thought. There is no such thing as an objective truth. There's only how we interact with our reality. Now often people read these works and go, well then I don't know, what am I supposed to make of this? Well, you just gotta figure it out. We talked about Faulkner and Sound and Fury. It's these brothers giving their version of this woman. We never get to find out the real truth of who Caddy is. That leads us very nicely into stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness writing is where you place into the text everything they think as they would think it, with no filter. When they're changing out, when you think about your thoughts, I realize that's a weird thing for us to do. You don't think in essays. You think in blurbs and flashes. And then as a writer, you have to carefully curate those and comb them into something that makes sense. They make their writing mirror the process of the mind. This is where the influence from Freud and Jung comes in. They try to use psychoanalytic technique and structures and reproduce the actual thoughts of their characters, hoping to get something more true, something that more clearly represents how humans actually think. This often means they go along without punctuation. They don't connect ideas. Faulkner, and I think it's in Requiem for a Nun, has a 35-page single sentence. It is exhausting. It's a lot of semicolons in that
Is it
sucker.
actually like a correct thing?
No, God, no.
Okay.
The problem I have with it is, I didn't realize until I read it, at the end of a sentence, we kind of subconsciously chew and swallow what we've just read, right? We process it and we put it away. At the end of the 35-page sentence, I went, I have no idea what happened. I have no clue. I don't, what happened here? Because I didn't have a moment to process. I wonder how much of that was intentional on Faulkner's part. All right, so we gotta go a little bit faster, that's all right. So, we talked about all this already. Oh, my brain hurts. That's from Monty Python. Anyway, saying my brain hurts. I know this is all difficult. We're gonna get through it all, it's gonna be fine. So, they use associative techniques. This is the allusions part. The modernists draw on history. They've rejected history as ultimate truth, but they use historical reference for like a shorthand. They're all very literate. They're all very well educated. They know a lot of stuff. And they expect you to know a lot of stuff when you read it. They use literary history, political and geographic history, philosophy, religion, on and on and on, to help us make connections to the text. It allows them to insert levels of meaning beyond what you see on the page. It's almost like they're using abbreviations, and you get to fill in what the abbreviations stand for through their use of allusion. Oh man, okay. We're going to do this so fast. There are major movements in visual art that don't exactly conform. They more or less align to some of these ideas of rejection of what came before and finding new ways to portray things visually. We're going to go through them with extreme speed. So, Cubism, we're not even going to talk about Fauvism. You've seen Cubist art before? Picasso's largely known as the major Cubist, right? Although Picasso's a major mover in all of these things. In Cubist artworks, objects are broken up and reassembled in an abstract form. Think of it as if I take a box and I cut all the tape off of it and I unfold it into a six-sided thing. They do that with like the human form, right? Dada, I love Dada. Dada is probably my favorite art movement. It's a Swiss and German movement primarily, founded in 1916. Dada is a nothing sound. It's like goo goo gaga. It's a baby sound. So calling it Dadaism was a way to say this is just a bunch of nonsense. Dadaism makes fun of art to a large degree. But you can see this is clearly borrowing some Cubist ideas. This is Nude Descending a Staircase #2 by Marcel Duchamp, my favorite artist of all time. It's also my favorite painting of all time. I really like it a lot. It's really good. You guys have seen this one?
No.
So Duchamp takes on a challenge. What are we supposed to do as painters? If photography can do everything we can do, how do we go further? So he decides he will start painting in 4 dimensions. So it's a 4-dimensional painting. What is the 4th dimension? Okay, well we can. We are in it all the time. You're in it right now. So, nope. So 2 dimensions, we got width and height, right? 3rd dimension is depth, right? We see in 3 dimensions. Unless you have one eye, then you see in 2 dimensions, right? You need 2 eyes for binocular vision. That's true. I'm not saying anything mean with that. Okay, so we see in 3 dimensions. We live in 4 dimensions because the 4th dimension is time. So how do you paint time? And he did it. He painted time. It's a woman going down the stairs. But it's not her going down one stair, it's her going down all the stairs. Here's her head, right? Here's her nose, here's her face, her breasts, her belly, upper arm and shoulder here, elbow, lower arm, hips, leg, leg. It's easier if you track her hips. But, going down the stairs.
Oh.
There she is.
That's so cool.
It's so cool.
That's weird.
Duchamp's the man. I love that painting. My first school I worked in, they had a hallway with all art in it, which was really neat, like famous paintings, right? And they had this up, but they had it upside down.
Wow.
I was very sad. All right, I did. I was like, come on.
What is it?
Come on, you can't have it upside down. They went, oh, sorry. Like, they were embarrassed about it. I wasn't being mean. I was just like, come on, man. Please don't put my favorite painting upside down. Anyway, Expressionism, trying to paint emotions. Munch's The Scream being probably the most famous. Go on, Stephen. Surrealism, the paintings that every college freshman puts up on their dorm wall. Oh, I'm so deep. I like Salvador Dali. Oh, college freshmen are the worst.
You're the worst too. What are you talking about?
What are you talking about? What? I'm the worst. I am the worst. I accept that. You know what? In high school, I did have a Dali piece on my wall. I am embarrassed of it. I had reflections of elephants on my wall. Oh, I was the worst. Ugh.
Wait, what's so bad about it?
It's just such a cliche thing of like, don't get me wrong. I hope you do like Dali. I hope you like all forms of art. But it's like, it's like abstract thought 101. It's like the super first level thing. You know what I mean? It's the thing that people discover and they're like, oh my God, I'm the first person to ever love this. And I'm like, no, you're not. Calm down. Relax. I'm glad you like it. That's good. Let me know when you get past intro, all right? But it's good. It's an important first step. It's all right. It's fine. It's just, very stereotypical. All right, so that was all just prologue to the real lecture of the day.
Wait, we're supposed to write anything?
No, you were.
Okay.
So, because here's the good news. All that stuff we just said about modernists all carries over into our discussion about postmodernism. We just need to add on to it a few twists. I promise I did not waste all that time. Postmodernism is more like a sequel to modernism. It's not a clean, hard break with modernism. It's the next thing. It's the next progression in it. If modernism is ultimately a response to World War I, which for convenience sake, again, we say it is, postmodernism, for convenience sake, is a response to World War II. And the really alarming part that we didn't learn anything from World War I and we didn't learn anything from World War II. Which is really, really scary. So, what prompted the change from modernism to postmodernism? A few things. One, there was a real belief that World War I wasn't going to be World War I. That it was the Great War and the last one. That we'd learned from something so horrific. Not only did we not learn, we end up with World War II, which is even worse. We see the horrors of the Holocaust and what we're capable of doing to one another. Mechanized mass genocide. Terrible, terrible stuff. It becomes clear that maybe humans aren't flawed. Maybe it's worse than that. Maybe we're evil. Maybe human beings actually shouldn't exist. That's a much different level of existential despair, right? So postmodernism is a term that encompasses a wide range of developments, a huge amount of stuff. Visual art, film, literature, architecture, on and on and on and on. It peaks in around late 60s, early 70s. With books like, let's see, I have some of them here. See Catch-22, which is awfully good by Joseph Heller. And where'd I put it? Well, Slaughterhouse-Five, right here. It's a coincidence they both have numbers in their title. It's not a coincidence that they're both books about World War II. Not all postmodernist works take place during World War II, but it's clearly a major factor in the movement. So, now, again, there's not a perfectly clear definition of postmodernism, in part because it is always trying to break free of being contained or defined in a set way. The modernists very much did see themselves as a movement. Postmodernists do not. They reject the idea of a club. If you say to a postmodernist writer, oh, so you're a postmodernist, they go, no. I just do what I do. I'm not part of any group. They hate being lumped in together. But it has quite a few similarities to the modernists. Both literatures explore external reality to look at inner states of being and inner truth. Both use fragmentation in their narration and narrative structure. Both use fragmentation in how they construct their characters. That's all very similar. Both completely mess around with all literary technique. But where the modernists are looking for meaning in the chaotic world, the postmodern author says there's no meaning to be found. That's an impossible and futile thing you're trying to do. It's all nonsense. You'll end up sad and disappointed. It's all bad. Don't even bother to look for meaning. It all sucks. It's kind of a parody of the quest for meaning. You can look for meaning, but you're not going to find it. Part of this is because of existentialism. Existentialism is this French philosophical movement, best put in terms of writers like Camus, where basically they're saying all of life is pain and suffering, and that's all there is to it. There's no point in your existence. It's all terrible. It's all bad, and then you die. The only release is when you're dead. Existentialism is not fun. It's interesting, but it's not a lot of fun. Exactly, the existential crisis. What's the meaning of this? Why do I suffer? What's the point? That's existentialism. So you can see the appeal of reading existentialist works. It makes you feel less alone in your suffering, but it does not give you a lot of solutions. I don't think high school students, by and large, should read existentialist works because it will not make them feel good about going to college. Make them feel like there's no point in anything, they should just stop. The thing that always makes me kind of laugh at existentialism, though, like Camus being a good example, Camus is like the existentialist, but he didn't commit suicide. He didn't end it all. You know what I mean? He still kept going because the world has great beauty in it, and it's worth pursuing those things. He died in a car crash. So, well, I think that's encouraging. He didn't end it all. That wasn't supposed to be sad. I mean, it's not good he died, but like, yeah, you know what I mean. All right, so now there's a certain distrust of the modernists on the part of the postmodernists. There's a loathing, there's a hatred, and a cynicism and a grieving in postmodern work. But there's something else that's really important. There's a sense of humor. The modernists are not funny. Faulkner's maybe the funniest of them, and he's not very funny. His humor is real dark, but it is pretty funny to me. The postmodernists are out and out funny. Catch-22, which I would highly recommend. It's terrific. And Hulu's putting out a miniseries of it, like next month. I cannot wait. Catch-22 is about bombardier pilots in Italy in World War II, and it is a comedy. They're dropping bombs on people, and the whole book is a series of jokes. It's an absurd and strange book. I love it to bits. So they also do their best to make a distinction, to attack rather the distinction between high and low culture. The modernists say they are not for everyone. You have to be well educated to enjoy a modernist work. You don't have to for the postmodernists. Postmodernists are fun. They're a good time. Reading Vonnegut is fun. Reading Heller is fun. You'll get more out of it if you get all their illusions, but you're going to have a good time no matter what. Yeah?
What does it mean, like high and low culture?
High and low culture is like fancy versus not fancy. High culture being like, I don't know, stereotypical examples would be like the opera, right? The theater. Low culture is like reality TV. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or fancy pants, not
Or what?
fancy pants or not fancy pants.
Pretty much. Fancy pants versus not fancy pants. Incidentally, one of my fantasy football teams is called the Fancy Pants. That's true. That's a true story. Anyway, so that's true. I don't know what to tell you.
You're weird.
That's fair. All right, so modernist literature sees a fragmentation and uses that in its work. The postmodernists really do believe that art can save us in the end. Well, wait, sorry. Excuse me. I'm getting confused because I've done this a couple days in a row. The modernists believe art can save us all. If we work hard enough, our books and our art can do it. The postmodernists believe the opposite. We've already lost the battle. We may as well have fun while the world burns. Everything's gotten worse and worse. World War II was worse than World War I. Art did not save us. If anything, all this navel gazing has made us even worse. We already talked about all that stuff. Oh, we did not mention this, though. There's also the constant threat of global annihilation because of the nuclear bomb and the Cold War. We have our shooter drills in school, and they're terrifying and horrible, don't get me wrong. But instead of having shooter drills when you were in school, you'd have bomb drills, where like you'd get a paper bag and put it over your head and get under your desk and huddle, like hug yourself. Not because it would protect you from the bomb, because maybe then you wouldn't see the flash before you're annihilated. I mean, terrible stuff. End of the world stuff.
I've never heard of that.
It's real bad. Yeah, people would say things like that. It was terrible. It was real bad. And that's what they're under constant threat of. I think we're growing up in hard times, certainly. I think this is tough. But we have to kind of remember that lots of times have been tough. We're not the only ones in it. So I think we shouldn't give in to despair, ultimately. Not that we shouldn't care. We should, but despair is maybe not a helpful feeling. Anyway, mankind's finally found a way to kill absolutely everyone, so how should we react? Most Americans, most people in the world, react by buying stuff, by getting more houses, more cars, newer things, having lots of kids, watching movies and TV. But there's another reaction. Portray and twist the absurdities of life and make fun of them. You laugh so you don't cry. Have you ever done that? Been in a situation where it's so horrible you start laughing? It's a weird feeling. It's helpful in a strange way. You feel better, but it's real dark.
Like if you're in the funeral and you're trying not to cry because you
Oh my God. My maternal grandfather, at his funeral, I think that was the hardest I've ever laughed. I was miserable. It was the worst funeral I've ever seen. It was so bad, I just started laughing because I was like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. I'm really enjoying it. It's just terrible. It was pretty small.
What was so bad about it?
35, 36. It was not long ago. So my grandfather, John, oh man, I don't know if we have time. We'll do it very quickly. So he was a World War II vet, very dignified man, right? And very old school. He didn't give hugs, right?
Yeah.
He'd shake your hand, he's old school. And at his funeral, they had this very old gentleman. I don't know how old he was, old guy. And they had these flag bearers, each of whom was an elderly lady, each of whom was around 4'6". Like they were just the tiniest creatures. And they had these flags and couldn't manage them. They kept trying to not let them hit the ground. And the guy doing the service, he had the service memorized because he has to do it a lot, right? That generation's dying off, so he knows the whole thing. And he'd say, whatever it is. And because it was a military funeral, he'd say, and in appreciation of his service, we now lay to rest. And he'd go, and he'd really think, and then he'd reach in his pocket and take out a folded piece of paper. And he'd go, John. The dude's name was John. You can't remember John? And then he'd slowly fold it back up, put it back in his pocket, and continue on until he got to say his name again. And so we have here the family of, John. And every time I'm dying, I'm bent over, this is the worst. This is the worst thing. And he wanted to get buried in Maine, right? So we're in Maine in February and it's cold. And we go to the plot where they're supposed to bury him, right? And we can't get him in the ground because the ground's too frozen, and they have a backhoe and just cha-gung, cha-gung, try and get in the dirt, and it can't. And they're like, you'll have to come back tomorrow to bury him. I was like, wow, that makes sense. That's perfect. And we're going back to the cars, and the guy who had done the service, who couldn't remember his name, he's standing trying to get in his car and can't get the keys to work. It's a beat up green Geo Metro, and he was living out of it, so all his stuff's inside there, and he's just chain smoking. Just one. I saw him he just wanted to light another. He's looking there, and he's angry at his car, and I was like, that's perfect. This is exactly how the day should end. Thumbs up. It was the worst, and I have rarely laughed that hard in my life. It was incredible. Anyway, I feel like that was a very postmodern experience. As we buried this man who was so dignified, tried to do everything right in his life, and had the worst funeral of all time. Amazing. All right, so postmodernists often demonstrate that chaos is insurmountable. So give in to the chaos. Use humor, use sarcasm, use irony. Because what else are you going to do? Also, Monty Python. Monty Python's maybe the most influential comedy group of all time, and it's a postmodernist comedy show. You should watch Monty Python. It's great. All right, so overview. There's no single truth of reality. Reality is always relative and constructed, and shifting. History, like fiction, is the product of the bias of the author. So how can I trust history? They write up the version they want me to read. We live in a world of uncertainty and fragmentation and visual and auditory overload. Power and control are asserted through institutions like churches, schools, and mass media, and they are therefore not to be trusted. In theory, if you were a true postmodernist, you would all stand up right now, tell me to go to hell, and storm out. You go, yeah, of course that's what you would want me to think, Bowman, you're part of the machine. You kick something over and run out, and I would be so proud of you. You can't do it now, though, because it'd be artificial. You'd have to do it before I said this. You'd have to go, no, bullshit, like tip over all my papers and storm out going, that's because you just want me to think like the machine, man. And then you, oh, God, I'd be so proud. But now it's too late. Now it's going to seem like you're doing it on purpose. No, it's too late. It's too late.
That's what you want us to think.
No, it is too late. Please don't mess up my stuff. Now, okay, so we're gonna make it. So the modernists work really hard using Freud and all this stuff to construct meaning. The postmodernists go even further. Instead of just having illusions, they start having imaginary illusions. They make allusions to things that don't actually exist. This is really, really cool stuff. They break the fourth wall. They completely destroy every idea we have of what should be in a book. Yeah, are you familiar with this idea of the fourth wall? I'll give you an example in a minute.
Like this picture, or
Yes. I'll give you some examples in a bit. Where modernists try to make the novel suit the shape of the mind, and they use that Freud and that Jung to kind of create a novel that works how your mind does, the postmodernists destroy the idea of the novel, saying that whatever I do is inherently valid because my mind has created it. Therefore it works. That's from Mr. Show, more postmodern humor. That's Bob Odenkirk from Better Call Saul. That's him, yeah. He's a comedy genius. Let's see. More overview. Look for extremely dark humor in postmodern works. Look for references to pop culture. The modernists tend to avoid pop culture. The postmodernists incorporate it into their work. They know it's part of society, so they may as well talk about it. They often make fun of it. They have a lot of references to celebrity and fame and what it means to be famous. I'm extremely concerned about celebrity and fame as a societal thing. When I talk to students about their goals in life, often they'll say it's to be famous.
yeah,
That makes me real nervous. That's bad. I'll say, oh, you want to be a singer? I want to be a famous singer. Ooh. So the fame's the thing. What do you want to be famous for? I don't know, whatever, I just want to be famous. Oh no. That's really bad. That's not good. All right. The use of the unreliable narrator. That is a big thing that we have to deal with. This is an extremely important note. Books like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest here are big on the unreliable narrator. The narrator of Cuckoo's Nest, which takes place more or less entirely inside an insane asylum, the narrator is one of the patients there named Bromden, although everyone calls him Chief Broom. Bromden's out of his mind. In the first chapter, he talks about robot arms coming out of the walls to insert like circuitry up in the orifices of his body. He narrates the book. You only get his version of events and have to figure out what's real and what isn't. It's a real problem. Sometimes the narrator just lies to you intentionally. It can be rather hard to figure out what's going on. Now we need to, when we analyze postmodern text, we look at how it's written, the form of it, what it's about, the content. We also look for intertextuality, how it's connected to other texts and other ideas, its historical place, and use of pastiche. That's going to happen a lot with Slaughterhouse-Five. Pastiche is when you combine together lots of different elements, particularly genres, into one new thing. People tend to label this as a science fiction novel. I disagree. I don't think it's science fiction at all. It uses tools of science fiction to make its point. That's pastiche. It makes its storytelling visible. We're going to read chapter 1 on Thursday of this book. It is unlike any chapter 1 you have ever read. It will be awesome. It uses fragmented or looping timelines. This is a non-linear book. Nothing in this book happens in order. And there are no transitions to clearly tell you what happens when. It's going to be really important you pay attention to keep track of what's going on. At some points in these novels, including this one, the author interrupts the narrator to stress a point to you. In his follow-up book, Breakfast of Champions, the narrator and the author show up and have a scene in the book. The protagonist of Breakfast of Champions is a guy named Dwayne Hoover. He's at the Holiday Inn at the bar, the hotel, and Vonnegut himself shows up and whispers to him. He goes, "Hey, how's it going?" And Dwayne's very upset. He's on the edge of madness. He says, "Here's the thing. I'm an author and you're my character and I created you." And Dwayne doesn't know how to deal with this, understandably. And he says, "No, you're not. That's crazy. I'm a real person." He goes, "No, you're not. Watch this." And transports him like to the North Pole and then to the moon and then back to the hotel bar. Dwayne has a hard time processing all this. And he is told that he's the protagonist in the book and every other character in it exists just to get a reaction out of him. That in a sense, he's the only real person in the world. This happens to tie into the idea of a science fiction novel he's recently read about robots taking over the planet. So he goes insane and starts attacking everyone in the bar just to see what they will do.
What's it called?
Breakfast of Champions. It's good. It's very profane. I cannot recommend it to high school students. Read it after high school. Okay, so let's see. That goes into this. It is often crude. They use a lot of slang and they use a lot of dirty stuff. They're often extremely violent. They're not polite books. They have an inconsistent tone. They'll be super serious and super funny back to back. They'll engage in metafiction. Metafiction, we touched on it a little bit already. Metafiction is writing that understands that it is writing and talks about itself as a creative work. Movies have gone meta at this point now. A lot of TV shows have gone meta. You'll see it where like the character will move around, take control of the camera, or they'll wink at the camera and therefore at the audience. The Office is kind of meta, but kind of not, because the notion of the show The Office is that there's a documentary crew following them, so they're still not breaking the fourth wall. They're not talking to the audience, they're talking to the documentary crew. So it's kind of fourth wall breaking, but not exactly. So, postmodern texts include eccentric, strange characters. They often have strange or funny names. They have lots of stuff going on, but don't always tie up all the loose ends into a solid conclusion. They blend the fictional and the historical. Slaughterhouse-Five is about time travel and aliens, but it's also about a real thing that happened during World War II, the firebombing of Dresden. So it's a historical novel, and it's a science fiction novel at the same time, hence we say it's a pastiche. They play games with the reader. There's hidden stuff. We'll talk about this stuff more in a bit, tomorrow, next class, not tomorrow. They often have large amounts of detail woven into the story. They mock things that are considered socially sacred: education, religion, government, wealth, marriage, relationships, whatever you can think of. Ooh, yeah, often. Vonnegut would say he's never experienced love, that the closest he ever came is when he's playing with his dogs. This is a man who was married with children. Wow. I'm not making that up. That's a thing he said. How dare you? I have a big heart. I'm a nice person. And I'm not that crazy about dogs, so you know. All right, let's see. Famous examples. Slaughterhouse-Five. We talked about, well, White Noise is maybe my favorite book of all time. It's my top 3, certainly. This is not a novel. I've talked about this one before by David Martson. No plot, no characters, absolutely nothing happens at all.
So what was the point?
Oh, it's great. It's really good. It's one of my favorite books.
What was the point?
I don't know. I don't know what the point of this book is. No, nothing happens. Nothing happens. There's no
Why is
characters.
it entertaining you? Why do you like it?
It's beautiful. It makes me cry every time I read it.
What's it normally like? What did they talk about?
It doesn't talk about much of anything.
So why do you like it?
But they do talk about something.
It's beautiful because instead of having a plot arc, it has an emotional arc. It's just a list of facts and ideas the author likes set in a certain order. Here, I'll show you. So like, let's see. John Reed died of typhus. Louise Bryant died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Not even to a philosopher could old age be easy in the depths of poverty, Cicero said. Nor could a fool find it anything but burdensome even amid ample wealth. Maria Giurizza was the first Tosca to sing Visa di Arte while lying on the floor, only because she had been elbowed off a couch by accident. It goes on and on. Anyway, we're still not done. Oh God, we gotta go faster. Okay, so we gotta talk about hero versus anti-hero. This will be very fast, but it's very important. Okay, who's this?
Oh my God.
That's Superman. Who's this? Who's this? All three of these people are extremely boring.
Why?
Just wait. He's interesting now, but he wasn't for 2 movies. First 2 movies, he's not interesting. Third movie, suddenly interesting. The first 2/3 of her movie, pretty good. Because it's the whole fish out of water story thing. I don't know that I'd want to be friends with Wonder Woman.
Why?
She's not very interesting. Superman, oh my God, so boring.
Okay,
He's the worst. Wolverine, on the other hand, I'd like to get a drink of Wolverine. He's an anti-hero. I didn't say he's bad. I said he's an anti-hero. Batman, Rick Sanchez, Liz Lemon, Harley Quinn. We like them because they're anti-heroes. So, Homer Simpson, anti-hero. The anti-hero is a protagonist who lacks traditional heroic traits. Traditionally, heroes are trustworthy, they're courageous, they're honest. Homer Simpson is a terrible person. He abuses his children. He's an alcoholic. He's lazy. He's stupid. He avoids his family and drinks at the bar with his friends every night. But we like him. You know who we hate? Ned Flanders. Hardworking, good father, pious and faithful, and we all hate his guts. Why? Flanders is a great dude. Flanders is great.
So for Family Guy, that he's an anti-hero too?
Absolutely. Most of the characters we like tend to be anti-heroes. They have our sympathy. It's sometimes hard for us to like them, but we're stuck with them. Bruce Wayne is an anti-hero. Bruce Wayne is a terrible person. Batman is a truly awful human being. He's so consumed with rage and vengeance, he goes out and beats up petty criminals to make himself feel better. That's not a good person. He's a billionaire who uses his wealth to abuse the poor.
Really?
And we all go, yay! Punch that guy in the face for stealing some money to feed his family.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's bad. They're very imperfect, maybe even unlikable. Logan, Wolverine. Oh, he is not a good person. We like him a lot, though. They have inner demons. So think about the ones we've talked about. Homer Simpson is crippled emotionally by his mother abandoning him and being raised by a distant, abusive father. Right? Batman, loss of his parents when he was young. Wolverine has lost everyone he's loved. They are haunted. They're often a screw-up or an outsider or a loner. That describes all of them. They're usually rebellious in some way. I'm going to post all this stuff. So, they struggle with good and bad. They're conflicted. Maybe they want to do the right thing, but they can't. They have paradoxical traits. They're a loner, but they want friendship. Logan would be a great example. He really wants that father figure and family while he pushes them all away.
What was Harley Quinn's thing? What was her thing?
She's fractured because I'm not really well versed in Harley Quinn. My understanding is she was the Joker's therapist, and through his abuse, he manages to switch her allegiances over and turn her evil. But I'm not super well versed on Harley Quinn. Let's see. Rocket Raccoon, perfect anti-hero. They're not role models. They're selfish. They're motivated by their own self-interest or self-preservation above that of others. They often make bad choices. When wronged, they act vengefully. They show little remorse for bad behavior. The anti-hero and the traditional hero are both protagonists. The anti-hero is not the antagonist. That's a really important distinction to keep in mind. Now, no spoilers for the movie. I'm not going to get into it. But as a general thought, I love Captain America. Captain America is who I want to be in life. But I want to hang out with Iron Man. He is not a good, he's the anti-hero. He's a womanizer, he's a drunk, he's often petty and cruel, but he seems like a fun guy to hang out with. Captain America is virtuous and good and honest and seems a little boring. He's very handsome, he's still boring. All right? He'd be the worst kisser in the world. He just, hey, and he gently give you a peck on the cheek. He'd give you a peck on the cheek and be like, third base, I'm sorry, and run away crying. You know? Totally true. All right. I know you guys thought that was going to get crude, and it got kind of sweet instead, which is weird. Antihero does not have a socially acceptable moral code. They're more relatable. I can't relate to Captain America. I wish I was like him, but I don't understand him. I get Tony. I understand him, Tony Stark. I get him. They're rarely successful. They often have interior battles. We love anti-heroes. All right, that is actually the end. We have actually gotten to the end of this whole thing. Thank you. All right, so what about what?
America's ass.
Oh, we're not going to talk about the new movie. All right, here's what I need to have happen.